Welcome to the Militia Gaming community. I'm Trigger, and in this guide, I'm going to show you 7 techniques that advanced players use to go faster in Need for Speed Unbound. Let's go! Real quick before I get into the video, I just want to say thank you for clicking on my video. I know there's tons of stuff to watch on YouTube, particularly on Need for Speed Unbound, just because the game recently released. So I just want to thank you for being here and watching this video. I have got tons of tips in this thing, and hopefully this helps you get faster at the game. If you have any questions, you can send me a DM. All right, let's get into it. This guide assumes that you understand the basics of driving in Need for Speed Unbound, like burst NOS, perfect start mechanic, grip versus drift turns. If you have any questions about any of those things, please pause and go back and watch my beginner guide first, and then return to this video. There's a link to that in the description of the video. With that out of the way, there are several advanced techniques professional Need for Speed drivers use to go faster. All of these techniques are not easy to do, let alone master, so even though you're watching this video to learn something new, simply knowing how to do this is not the same thing as mastering it. I can make a three-pointer and I can kick a ball into a net, but that doesn't make me Steph Curry or Lionel Messi. The players who master these driving techniques are not even human, and most casual players will not reach that level. That being said, you can actually greatly improve your times by adding a few of these skills to your bag of tricks for online and solo play. Here are the 7 techniques that I'm going to be going over today. There are timestamps in the description if you ever want to come back and reference how to do something after you've watched the video. Micro drifting, chirping, chaining, line extensions, burst timing, burst turns, and double dipping. First up, micro drifting. The goal of this technique is twofold. Number 1, it sharpens your turning angle, allowing you to make tighter turns, and number 2, it builds burst NOS. This technique, although used in many places, is probably the most noticeable in long, sweeping highway turns at high speeds. Cars like this Regera are notorious for it, and it's one of the reasons why that car is overpowered. Microdrifting is very challenging to do right, but when you get it, it feels awesome. You know you're microdrifting when your tires are producing tire smoke, but your controller is not vibrating. If you play with vibration off or on a keyboard, you can recognize it by seeing the tire smoke, but feeling like your car is completely gripped to the road. What you don't realize is that it's actually not gripped to the road at all, and there's a very thin line between full grip and full drift, and that line is where you've positioned your car. It's very hard to describe, but it's really based on a feeling. It's very easy to lose a micro drift by giving it too much gas, or too much brake, or steering too hard. Doing this technique correctly, especially at higher speeds, is like being able to balance on a tightrope in 40-mile-per-hour winds. To initiate a micro drift, it's best if you have brake to drift in your tuning settings. You can use the brake or gas option if you want, but you basically just tap the brake mid-turn, telling the game you want to drift. Then immediately start to balance your steering and your throttle. Every car has a certain tolerance level, and some cars will allow you to microdrift easier because their line between grip and drift is actually fatter. The Regera is one of those, but in general it seems easier to pull off in grippier builds. It feels like the more grippy the build is, the easier it is to microdrift. You should be microdrifting whenever you have a chance because it builds up your burst NOS and it doesn't seem to slow you down like a regular drift would. Next, let's talk about chirping, chaining, and line extensions because these 3 techniques actually serve the same general purpose. And that purpose is to keep your burst NOS alive for use on an upcoming corner. We've all done it. We've used our burst on a straight only to have to brake for the turn shortly after. Sure, you're gonna go faster on that straight, but the benefit isn't nearly as valuable as using that same exact burst mid-corner. Usually the reason this scenario happens is because the distance between when you're rewarded your burst and the next corner is too long, and the burst will expire before you get there, meaning you're gonna lose it. If the only options are to use it and then brake shortly after, or lose it completely without using it, of course you're gonna use it. But if you find yourself in that situation, chirping, chaining, or line extensions are gonna be your friend. So first up, chirping. Chirping is the only reactive thing that you can do, meaning you weren't prepared for the next corner to be that far away from you, and you're about to lose your burst. All you have to do is simultaneously tap your brake or gas pedal, whichever one you have set as your drift entry in your handling tuning menu, and jerk the steering wheel at the same time, either left or right, very quickly, then get back to center. Your tires will chirp and your burst NOS meter will either fill up a little bit or just simply stop from emptying for just a couple of seconds. This couple of seconds gives you enough time theoretically to get to the next corner for correct usage of that burst or to add more burst to it. Chaining is a proactive, intentional method of preserving and building burst through multiple corners. This only works when the corners are back to back. There is a very short amount of time until the game recognizes you are no longer turning and rewards you with the burst NOS for the corner you just took. If you can initiate another turn before that amount of time is up, then the 2 corners you just took will actually be rewarded as if it was one large turn, and thus you have chained those 2 corners together. You can see from this example that I make 2 separate turns, but I'm only rewarded 1 time. If I transitioned these 2 turns slowly or lazily, the game rewards me for the first corner only, and it expires before I can even finish the second corner, and then I'm rewarded for the second corner. This is only for gripping turns because drifting builds burst that is usable immediately anytime you are drifting. And now for line extensions. Usually in racing games, you want to exit the corner with as much speed as possible in the direction that you need to go. You do that by following the racing line. You start wide, you turn into the apex, and end wide. However, depending on the turn and what follows the turn in Need for Speed Unbound, you will actually need to adjust your line to make the turning motion longer than what the road suggests. It's tough to explain, so I'm just going to show you an example. On this turn for the race Blue Collar, if you take the line that the road gives you, the game will reward you with less burst and it will expire before you get to the next corner. So you need to avoid that. You need to extend that line by starting your turn earlier, making it a longer sweeping style turn, and not ending the turn until you reach the side of the road again, like you're seeing Waterblob do right here. This does 2 things for you. It rewards you with more burst for a longer turn, and it allows you to keep that burst going into the next corner, which is helpful for taking the corner with more speed and even chaining it for a later corner. Line extensions are not necessary on most turns, and the easiest way to know if you need to do it is to pay attention to my event-specific guides like the one I just put out on Blue Collar. In those guides, I show you what the pros are doing and what lines to take for specific races. Next, let's talk about burst timing. Burst timing is simply using your burst at the correct times during a corner, after a corner, or on a straight. This technique mostly comes into play on the speed races that are on the highways. When racing in those races, you'll notice that there are turns that reduce your speed because they are slightly tighter than the other ones. On those turns, you will want to have a burst of NOS to limit the amount of speed loss. It also helps to have banked some of the blue NOS as well for this. A full 3 bars of burst will allow you to maintain your speed into those corners and sometimes increase it. Your goal is to be cruising at top speed for as long as you possibly can during these races. To build those bursts up, you can try to get a few near misses leading up to those turns from AI traffic or cops. Cops reward a significant amount of burst for near misses, but their movement, as you know, is unpredictable, so it's a high risk equals high reward situation. This next technique is very closely related to burst timing, but it's really helpful on sharper turns that you want to take at higher speeds. It's called burst turning. Generally, you are traveling too fast leading up to a burst turn to grip it or drift it for that matter, and since using burst actually tightens up your steering angle, using it mid-corner is almost like cheating. It makes your car grip up instantly and shoot around the corner. It is maybe the most difficult technique in this guide to master because if you don't time it right and you don't prepare for the burst by lightening up your steering, it could send your car into a tailspin or fishtail. Again, it's a high risk, high reward situation. If done correctly like you see in this background gameplay, it is the single fastest way to take a corner at high speeds. This one for sure takes practice, but it's so worth it. You can actually practice this on regular slower corners. Start your grip turn, then when you pass the halfway point of the turn and you are accelerating out of it, pop your burst. I recommend completely letting off the accelerator when you hit your burst because it helps control the burst. But make sure you jump right back on shortly after so you don't lose any speed. It should look something like the example you're seeing in the background gameplay. This practice is a different type of burst turn, but if you master that, you can start to understand what it's like on higher speed corners, and then you can practice your high speed corners. And that actually leads me into the final technique for this video, double dipping. There are two ways to double dip. The first is when you enter a corner with some burst, you pop that burst mid-turn like I just described, and then you receive more burst for gripping that turn. It happens a lot if you time the first burst correctly. It's not the hardest thing to do. You basically just need to be gripping that corner when you use that first burst, and you need to use the first burst before you complete the corner. Once complete, the second burst will be awarded. The second way to do this is if you enter a corner with no burst and you drift the first part of it, which awards you with a single bar of burst. Then you grip up mid-turn and use that single bar you just received to finish the turn. You will then be rewarded on top of that with grip burst for completing that entire turn. It's a little tougher to do because you need to enter the corner in a drift, then control the car enough to grip up, then use the burst. And it all happens super fast. Now, whether you use that second burst after the corner or not is really up to you, and it's really dependent on what is next for that race. Again, this is one of the more difficult techniques to master, but if you can get it right, it is super helpful for your races because you're going to be double dipping your burst on one corner. Alright guys, that is it for this guide. Shout out to all the Heat 5 members of the channel. I appreciate all your support, and if you're loving what you're seeing here and want to support the channel, please become a Heat 5 member today by hitting that join button below this video. Thank you so much again for watching. I will catch you on the next one. Trigger out.